or live or watching this later, that's great. I'm here with Steve Tendon and Joshua Barnes, and we'll do a quick introduction of us, and then we'll talk about what this thing is. It's different and should be fun and informative all at the same time. So, quick intro for me. I'm the Director for Thought Leadership at Agile Scale Programs, but I pretty much do whatever's necessary, what I think would be good. I was given that title. And although pretty much Agile at Scale is what I do, I created the Discipline Agile Value Stream Consultant Workshop, which was based on the Flex system that Net Objectives had created. That goes back like about 15 years on how we did Agile at Scale. So there'll be some talk about that. I also have a strong tech background, so I can talk about things like design patterns, Christopher Alexander's timeless way of building. So, we invite questions and things of that nature. But I'll hand it off to Steve now to give a quick introduction of himself.
Thank you, Al, and good night, or good morning, or good evening. It's midnight here, so I am maybe a bit sleepy, and apologies for that. So I'm Steve Tendon. I am the creator of the TameFlow approach. And I have been dabbling around in this space of collaborative knowledge work for quite a while. I focus a lot on the human aspects, human elements, sustainability, and as all, I also have this shared background with patterns which have deeply influenced my way of thinking. And I'll hand over to Joshua.
Hi, everyone. I'm Joshua Barnes, and I'm the founder of Process Mentors. And a lot like Steve said, we focus a lot on enabling from a human standpoint organizations that we work with. So I'm just thrilled to be here with both Steve and Al. And as Al started off, this is going to be, I think, a little informal and a lot of fun. And we'll be looking for any, for those of you that are watching this live, comments, post that you're here, where you're from, any questions that you've got for us. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Al.
Yeah, I wanted to start out with what the inspiration for this event was and why we called it both Uncommon Sense. And if you read, there was an article I put on LinkedIn, post talked about the technology gap. There's a phenomenal book, I think it's out of print now, but you can probably get a used copy, and I highly recommend it, called Unlimited Wealth, and it's by Paul Pilsner. And he talks about that in the old days, hundreds of years ago, what you had was wealth was based on the amount of resources you had, how much gold, how much land, how many people under your control. And then when the information age came, or not information, when technology came around, the industrial age came around, you could combine the resources you had, the physical materials and things you had, and multiply it by some factor of technology, like going from, I guess wooden spears to iron to steel as an example. That's maybe a bad metaphor because it's about war and stuff. But technology times resources made a difference. And then, though, as technology got more and more, actually, it's technology to a exponential power. So technology squared, maybe technology quadrupled, that things just go up dramatically. And I'll give an example. I am an environmentalist, but it sounds at first like not an environmentalist thing, but like oil is an example. That years ago, when I was growing up, it was like 7 miles to the gallon or something. And when cars got better at 30 miles to a gallon, in some sense, you all of a sudden have 4 times the amount of oil. As we can explore more, you have more oil. Technology has made that possible. Now with solar and wind and things, technology is making energy again, more resources times the technology factor as we do things. So technology is it's more than multiplicative, it's actually exponential. And when the information age comes in, something else happens. See, up and through the industrial era, if somebody made something, like say a DVD player, and I buy it, I've handed them my money for their work and materials. But in the information age, I can share information, and I still have the information, and the person using it has information. So this potential of exploding value is even multiplied more in the information area. So there's an interesting aspect, though, in Pilsner's book, is not only is the technology increasing as we go, but there's what he calls the technology gap. In other words, what's possible versus what's being used. And an example I think he gave was the fax machine. When you have two fax machines, you've got not a lot possible, but the potential, I mean, or not a lot used, but the potential of fax machines was great. Then the internet, that just exploded it beyond anything you can believe. So the technology gap is what is potentially capable with the technology we have, yet what is actually taking place. Now, the reason I think this is an interesting conversation is I personally believe, well, there is no end to how much better you can get. I don't know if there's an upper limit, but let's say there was an upper limit. Let's say we're at 80% of what we can learn how to do. I would say the amount that we're actually implementing is maybe 10% of that. So the point is there's much more value in closing the gap than trying to extend the gap by getting more and more technology. You know, and that's funny for me because I have spent a career of expanding what's possible. I continuously do that. We keep thinking of new ways to do things. But what I'm also trying to do is say, okay, instead of learning new things, what's more important is to get everybody to learn the stuff that is already out there. And one last thing on this, and then we'll just open it up and see how we go. So I've been in computers since 1970 when I started university. And for the first 32 years, I was primarily a developer. So I still have developer in my bones. It's like you can never get rid of it. I still have a tendency to talk about making things more effective and more efficient when it really, as hopefully Joshua and Steve would testify that in the DAVSE, it's about business agility, looking at portfolios, driving it through the whole thing. But I mention this because I've been around a long time. And like when XP came out, and I discovered it in 99, that might have been the year it came out too, but that's when I found out about it. It was like I loved it. I loved it because I had already been doing most of the practices individually. I'm not claiming I was doing XP. I was doing nothing like XP, but I recognized the individual pieces. And when I saw it, oh man, what if you put this together like they're saying? It was just amazing. And anyway, so I've been doing Agile since 99, pretty much the form right after Net Objectives came into existence. And what I noticed is a lot of stuff that came out in 2001 to 2004, 2005 is still around, even though a good half of it is wrong. And another good, well, maybe not a good half of it, a good fourth of it is wrong, and another good fourth of it has been superseded by many better things. So it's like, wow, we are really holding on to a lot of old technology, not getting rid of the stuff. We've got better methods, and some things we thought back in those days weren't really that good to be thinking about. And yet when I look now, almost 2 decades later, I still see that stuff. So that's why we picked that as myths. What are we hanging on to that isn't really true? And what's missing? Myths and missing. There's a lot of stuff we should let go of, and there's a lot of stuff we should embrace that has a proven track record. And I mean proven. Like some of the stuff I'm going to talk about today has been around for 15 years, and yet you still barely see it. So I'm going to stop at that point, and let's see if Josh or Steve have something to say, because if they don't get it in now, you know me, I talk a lot. They may not get it in.
So I'll take my chance then, Al. And I'll start off with a reflection on this technology gap. So it's very interesting, the framing of what is the actual potential with respect to what you're actually getting out of the technology. And here we use technology in a very broad sense. I think there is also another kind of gap, which is even more subtle and subversive. And it happens primarily in the mind of the people. You know, I work a lot with mental models, and I'm also deeply into emerging technologies. One of my activities is in the blockchain space, and I've spent countless hours explaining this technology to people who don't know it. So what is this this mental gap that I refer to? Well, let's take an example that we certainly can relate to. The boundary stone. Just a few weeks ago, there was a case in Belgium, if I remember correctly, where a farmer had a boundary stone in the middle of his field. And on the left was Belgium, and on the right was France. And that stone was in his way when he was going around with his tractor. So he thought, okay, I'll just move it to the edge of the field. And that almost created a diplomatic accident between France and Belgium today in the European Union. I don't know what happened afterwards, but why was that accident possible at all? Well, because we had this concept in our mind that that stone, which has zero value, it's a rock, is demarcating, let's say, property rights. And for us, it is obvious. It's a boundary. But let's go back. Let's go back a long, long time. Let's go back to when our ancestors were hunters and gatherers. They were roaming the globe and, well, finding their food where it happened to be. Then someone smarter than all the rest came up with the idea of farming. And what do you need to farm? You need land. And around this land or across this land, you had all these other folks who were roaming on your land. So probably that's the origin of the boundary stone. Or you put that there, say, no, dare you if you cross that boundary. And the other guys, the farmers, they would probably scratch their heads and say, well, what is this? No, we've been running around across this land for ages, forever. How can you even conceive of that there is a property right on a piece of land shown by a stone? The stone is a technology. And there you see the gap between mental models. The old model of the hunter who does not conceive of the notion of property rights, and the farmer for whom the property right is a vital element. And that property right comes about through technology, the boundary stone. A very simple technology, but nonetheless technology. And tying this back to the topic of this series, I think that in this space of what shall we call them, frameworks, methodologies, approaches, we are in a similar situation where there are some new boundary stones being planted in this field, in this domain, and the hunters and gatherers of this domain just don't see what is beyond it. So there is a barrier, a mental barrier that keeps them back, holds them back. And I think what we wish to do, at least I have this proposition in this series, is to enlighten what is beyond that boundary stone. What is the farming that is so much more efficient in producing food rather than chasing animals and being possibly, the victim of lions and others who are chasing you. So that's how I see what we can do in this series.
Yeah, I'm just going to interject some quick comment. Then Joshua would like. It really makes me realize that a lot of times I'm talking about certain concepts to people who can't conceive of what I'm saying because it's just not in their vernacular. It's and I kind of know that. I say kind of know that consciously when I stop. I know that. But how many times during the day am I acting as if I know that? And I think that's a good reminder, Steve. I'm gonna keep that in mind. The boundary stone. I like that.
And what I'll add in is so oftentimes we see sort of where we're at or where teams or where people in an organization are at, and where they could be at, let alone what is potentially possible. And I think that we see, you know, the teams of the people in the organization that have come in that have sort of what they think is the agile mindset, and they look at the traditional teams and they look at governance and look at project managers, and they think you're so firmly rooted in one way of doing things and you're not open. But then you look at how they're approaching their work and they are firmly grasping on one particular way or a set of old practices without going anywhere beyond that, where they could be making incremental improvements, but they're just not open to it. And it's that's part of the bridge that with part of this that I'm going to help try and build as well.
Yeah, well, I'm going to put out the first a practical piece of this too. That was an example of something that ties these two pieces together. So, like when XP first came out, and they talked about stories, and the metaphor for a story, it's not actually a metaphor. Story isn't the metaphor. Story is like, say, Joshua and I are working together on a project that we talk about the requirement. We talk about what's needed. We're talking about the customer. We're talking about the system. We're talking about what's possible. And we're actually telling a story. We're actually describing something, talking back and forth to each other. And then if somebody wants to build that, or we want to build that, we actually recount it, not in documentation, but say, well, Al and Joshua had a conversation like, and we tell the story later that this is what happened. And that's the idea of a story. And I like that because it's stories are, I mean, they can be written down, but it's really a recounting of something that happened. And that's really what story comes from. And then you had big stories, you know, like Lawrence of Arabia, one of my favorite epics. And that's where epic came from. Now, epics has since been turned into something like an initiative or something like that. And yet we still, something that came out a long time ago for a team. Let's see, this is the other thing one you need to look at. Agile, people still use the manifesto for Agile software development. I use the whole name because Agile Manifesto for software development, that software development is ignored a lot. This thing was designed by a bunch of people who are working on small teams building software. Okay, and things were different back in 99, well, 2001 when the manifesto came out. But the point is there is a tendency that a lot of these things that we learned about Agile 20 years ago, it was team-centric. Look at the Agile software, the manifesto for Agile software development, and it doesn't mention management at all. It's all team-centric. Teams mentioned like 17 times, I think. So story and epic made a lot of sense. And then for epic to now mean what it means in the safe world of like an initiative and some big thing that has to be turned down, that's okay. It's a different change. But think about how we do Agile development at scale. What we do is we've got this big thing. We break, if you're doing PI planning or something, you break small pieces, and then you figure out how to coordinate all these pieces. How do these features get together? How do we build things? But what's missing? So the myth I would suggest is that epics are still useful. Oh man, I just did something heretical. I hope I don't get burned. Sorry, I couldn't help myself. But what is needed is the concept when you fund something, when we budget for something and say we're allocating these funds. Wouldn't it be amazing if you had something that denoted the business value, but not just that? There's also how customers use it. That's called their operational value stream, attended to that. There's how do we transition to getting it used, which is a kind of marketing involvement. It's a kind of, you know, marketing internal or external. It's a kind of how do you do support? How do you do your infrastructure? How do you do your ops? There's all this stuff in addition to the business need, which, by the way, we want it to be in a small chunk so we can deliver it faster. And then there's all this ancillary stuff that if you don't have, you get no value from. So what we want to do is look at it in a business organization from a business value. What's this chunk that we can deliver, that a customer can consume and we can support? And that's not an epic. That's not a feature. Okay. Like we can't have on an airplane, we have a feature. Oh, this thing turns left. This thing turns right. Oh, we're going to do a feature this week. Then come back later. We'll get it to turn right next week. Doesn't make any sense. Features by themselves may be releasable, but may not be usable. So this notion of a chunk of value that's minimal in size has business value, we call a minimum business increment. Its heritage is the minimum marketable feature. And it's that when you work on it, the whole organization knows what's needed, knows they're playing it. And I'll let Steve talk about his move, because it's a comparable concept. But when you step back and look at it, this is not an MVP. I just want to be very clear. An MVP, at least by Eric Ries's definition, is I'm discovering something that's new. It's usually a small team investigating things. You don't have to deal with the whole organization. You're probably not doing massive marketing. In fact, Eric Ries says don't do that at the start. You're trying to deal very close with the customer. The needs of these two things are quite different. And taking an MVP and moving it into I've got an established large organization that has to do with many, many people. You don't have that problem in an MVP, but you do have it in most things at scale. So this is both the myth and the missing piece for me. And Steve, why don't you follow? Because I know you have a comparable concept you call a move in TameFlow. Actually, let me make a point about that. Or as Steve mentioned, I mean, why is it the three of us? He didn't talk about why did the three of us come together. Well, we've known each other for a long time. And yes, disciplined agile through the PMI, we have our own agenda. We have our own way of doing it. It's not a framework. We'd like to sell it, of course. We'd like to get trainers and all that and people who've taken it and all that. But I'm blessed that at the PMI, what we're really interested in is how do we add value to the community? And I've got a lot of free reign. I mean, this talk series is a point of that. And so we're interested in how do we bring in new ideas, and TameFlow and Flex, the two systems by myself and Steve, or by the PMI, but I'm the primary guy in it, I guess. They're comparable. They're not competitors because they actually, although they're comparable in the thought process, they take the approach on how you bring it out to the market in different ways. And Joshua is he's a disciplined agile trainer of DAVSC. So we've got kind of all these perspectives. And one thing we hadn't mentioned is we're going to rotate who hosts it. This is my hosting, or all three of us. And then we'll rotate through Steve's next week where he can get a more normal time. And then Joshua, and then we're going to have guest hosts as well. But anyway, Steve, why don't you talk a little bit about Move and how it's the same or different from what I described?
Yeah, I think this point that you just made about the compatibility of our ways of thinking presumably stems from the underlying pattern of thinking that we've developed in the course of the years. And many patterns have common origins or common experiences. So it's not surprising on the one side that we arrive at things which are, as you said, comparable, very, very similar. And on the other side, that where there are differences, they are still part of a construct of, let's use Fred Brooks' term of conceptual integrity. So the things that I do in TameFlow can easily coexist with things that are happening in DA. And the MBI, the Move, is one of these instances. I also started off with the minimum marketable features of the incremental funding method. Then this thing has had several names, but recently I started calling it the Move. Why? Because my focus is primarily on the business perspective, even though the Move still bears all the organizational weight that it has in actually managing the flow of work through the teams. And Move is an abbreviation, which is the minimal outcome value effort. In other words, the minimal effort that you need to produce in order to deliver an outcome or bring home a business value. The concept of minimality is absolutely critical in my view, and the Move defines a minimal target scope. Note very, very well that I do not say fixed scope, so we don't need to to fall into the debate whether this is waterfall or not. So I say target scope. Even a sprint has a target scope. It's basically the number of story points, if you're using story points, the number of story points that you can fit into the sprint. The difference is that in Scrum, you are determining the target on the basis of a time box, while the move, in my perspective, is determined on the basis of the minimal scope that has a value. In other words, the minimal thing that someone would actually pay for, or that there is an outcome that determines an observable effect, that someone is like changing behavior or is gaining some benefit. The minimality requirement is critical, and it is a key in bringing up the level of performance in the sense of business performance. If you do too much beyond the minimum, then obviously you are wasting precious resources. You are incurring in unnecessary delay, and then you have the cost of delay. If you're doing too little, then you cannot sell it because it's not minimal. Someone would not buy a car with two wheels, so to say. You need all four of them. So it's this balance. And notice that this balance is not only like theoretical, it is representative. We speak in terms of patterns. All in patterns, we try to identify the opposing forces that come into being in that context. And if you look at any software development effort, it's a number of forces that fall on two sides. Some want to do less, and others want to do more. The classical one is sales, that is promising way beyond what engineering can deliver. Now, everyone has been experiencing that, but we also have, for instance, the financial management and marketing. Marketing also wants to put in as much stuff as possible because the competitors are doing this and that, so we need to do that as well and more. While finance say, hey, we have only so much money, we cannot fund all of this, so we need to break, stop down. We have, for instance, QA and security. QA, in order to ensure quality, will request more things, even to a fault at times, and you get to polishing the doorknobs. And while security, you want to reduce the attack surface, so the less things you put into the software, the less likely it is to be attacked. So I just made 6 players, 6 roles in the company, and you see that 3 of them are pushing up and 3 of them are pushing down. So the move is where you have the balance of those forces. And of course, as this move is progressing through the organization and going through the Kanban boards and the value streams, all these forces are learning. They are learning things about the environment, about the competition, and even the regulatory element. So the conditions you have at the start of the work might not be the same during and after. So you need the flexibility to change where that borderline is. It can go up and down. If a competitor comes up with a new version and all of a sudden you are completely obsolete, well, you have to go back to the drawing board, and maybe you have even to scrap what you're doing. If there is some regulatory requirement that comes and affects your business or your clients, well, maybe before you do the next release, you need to make sure that you're compliant. So that borderline is always moving. Now, of course, there is a risk that this might be moving too much, so the thing becomes too large, and we are actively fighting that tendency. There are many mechanisms for this, but it's the notion of the batch size. You want to have small batch size, and how do we realize that? Well, go back to the economic element. The smaller the batch, the faster you're generating value. So there is a business reason not only an efficiency reason to focus on reducing the batch size. So I see this as very compatible with your MBIs. Maybe someday we should do a more detailed mapping. But the move has this like business perspective, which, by the way, originates from a lot of work I did in the past in merger and acquisition operations, where first you have to assess the software organization if there is the capability that you want to buy. And if you do buy it, you need to put together the two teams or organizations, cultures. And often the acquisition happened because they were doing more or less the same things. And then you have to bring these things together. So what is the container that brings things together from different code bases? Well, that container for me was the move. That was like the embryonic origin of how the move came about. But okay, this is history, and we've gone way beyond that.
Well, I do want to interject one thing, because actually listening to you, I see a dynamic between moves and MBIs that we should explore more. Because with the MBI, what I do is I'm focusing more on the flow of the artifact. Like we have the strategy, it's got an initiative, then we come up with an idea, then we define it as a small thing, then we look at all these things around. And it definitely is a workflow perspective, which is not inconsistent with what you do with moves. But and I've heard you say this before, but I heard more detail here. You're talking a lot more about the dynamics between the different people doing all this workflow. And it is a blend of the two. It is a blend of the workflow and the people involved in the workflow. So I definitely think I could, kind of bring some of that stuff in and it would be effective. But anyway, I wanted to comment that, but yeah. Joshua, you've been very patient.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I wanted to mention was when we're talking about minimums, and that's an area that I actually really like to focus on with teams and organizations. So that minimum marketable release, and what is it? And when we get teams or we get, individuals that are thinking more towards a minimum marketable release, I think a lot of times what they're missing is what is that chunk of value we're trying to deliver. Because if that chunk is going to require a minimum marketable release beyond one of the products, right, one of the software systems, then the user, the customer, isn't going to get value until the other minimum marketable releases. And then with the MBI, Al, you've been talking about is it's the combination of all those things, right? So if you've got a typical large project and there's 20 features a team's going to do in the span of a year, well, 3 of those features might be connected with another 1 or 2 features that other teams are working on in their big scope of work. So we're trying to say, let's identify that functionality across 1 or more of those platforms that we have to make an enhancement to deliver value to a customer. And that's part of what the minimum becomes. And I think that's just, we see so much waste and so much time that goes by and so much lost opportunity, the way work is approached at so many organizations these days still.
Now, I have another topic that will set you up, Steve, but Joshua, you've been trailing this whole time. Is there a topic you'd like to bring up, or do you want me to bring up this topic?
No, I know you've got a number of topics that
okay, I gave you your shot.
Well, this was the one that you were hosting, so
yeah, that's true.
Your list, right?
So I'm going to set you up, Steve, with an observation. Right. I'll give you a hint, though, so you're not wondering. It has to do with complexity and inherent simplicity. And I'm going to set it up so you can talk about inherent simplicity. And the reason I want Steve to talk about this is I am very much enamored with Dr. Eli Goldratt's work. He's the guy who wrote The Goal, The Theory of Constraint. Actually, another book of his I like as much as I like The Goal, and it had just as much impact on me, is called Choice. And in The Choice, it's really a lot of critical thinking, and I learned a lot. And he talks about inherent simplicity, which I will let Steve do because he knows theory of constraints a lot better than I do. I feel like not totally an amateur next to him with theory of constraints, but not the professional he is in that area. But I wanted to make an observation because I think one of the myths and missing pieces we have has to do with complexity in the Agile space. I think it's somewhat misunderstood. and somewhat holding us back. And something that's not talked about that I think is way more important are chaotic events. Now, a chaotic event is also known as a nonlinear event. It's when some small thing happens and it causes a very big impact. One of the most famous examples is actually the Titanic. The collision with the iceberg was not that big. A small hole was what was created. There were other problems that all combined together, resulting in a poor design. There's a whole lot. I've studied the Titanic a lot. The sulfur content of the iron, or the steel there were a variety of factors. But 3 Mile Island is perhaps a better example of chaotic events. But it wasn't just the chaotic event. And a chaotic event is a small thing happening that causes a big impact. It's not the same as chaos. Chaos is a state. Chaos means you're in a state of chaos. You can't see what's going on. It's all sorts of stuff happening. You can get to a state of chaos through many, many, many simple things happening all at once. It's just crazy. You'll fire in a crowded auditorium, you've got chaos. Okay. The specific people who get injured or not, that may be just random and complex, but the chaos that's present. So I'm not talking about the state. So in 3 Mile Island, I was reading this book, Meltdown. I recommend it. It's not a lot of new information, but I really like the way he presented it. And I got this huge insight from it. And I like anecdotal stories. I like people describing things. And he talks about 3 Mile Island. He brings a few things together that were, when I heard him talk about it, I was like, oh my God, I knew this, but I didn't know it as well. It wasn't present. By the way, I call these DINsights. Insight. That was just the name I made up with one of my associates years ago when we were talking about things we both knew, but it's like, insight. Yeah, I knew that. I didn't know I knew it. Anyway, 3 Mile Island, what happened? A fairly not significant event happened, but there was no visibility on what was going on. And the reason there wasn't any visibility on what was going on is the way they were measuring water levels and stuff. There was like, well, we're going to measure it here and we presume it's the same water as over here, but in fact, it wasn't. So you didn't have visibility. Nobody could see what's going on. You had this small event happen. No one knows what's going on. But things were tightly coupled. So when one thing happened, it caused something else to happen. It caused something else to happen, caused something else to happen, and almost had a meltdown. And the insight I got was that you could disagree, many events that are ending up being catastrophes happen because some little thing happened. And then out of that, something we didn't have visibility on happened and things were coupled. Most catastrophes happen this way. Now, I'm not saying that all catastrophes happen this way, because sometimes what happens is it's like people are negligent. Like there was a dam, I forget, in the Southwest years ago. It was an earthen dam, and you could see it was leaking, and they just didn't think it was a problem, and it eventually collapsed, and people died. There are many dam failures where I think it was more negligence than lack of visibility. But a lot of times in designs of things, they're not designed robustly enough. They're not designed with enough redundancy, and some small thing happens, and then it gets worse and worse and worse, and nobody notices it until it's too late. And I got the metaphor of what I'll call gunpowder, or the gunpowder drill. The metaphor is, with gunpowder, you have three agents. You have charcoal. You have saltpeter. Saltpeter is an oxidizing agent. It kind of makes the charcoal burn. And you also have sulfur, which is kind of controls it. And you have an explosion when all three of those are present. And I would say the problem in complex systems isn't the complexity itself directly, but rather it's you have some chaotic event that is coupled, some little events coupled to other things. And because there's no visibility, it turns into this massive thing. And it usually is not visible because of the complexity. So the complexity has a factor, but the complexity has to do with not seeing what's going on. Let me take this a little from theoretical to practical. Customers and product managers are talking to each other, and there's a slight misunderstanding. Like maybe one of them's talking about it in meters and the other one's talking about it in feet, and they don't know that. And you can imagine, I'm talking about Mars Navigator, Explorer, one of those where you had this miscommunication. A small mistake kills the whole project. It's because there's no feedback on what's happening and things were coupled. In our world, you have a small mistake by a product manager and it goes off course. In waterfall, what's so bad is the feedback, the visibility of whether it's accurate or not takes months. In the agile space, the feedback should be quick. In fact, if you're using the side on your specifications, your test specifications up front, how will I know I've done that? Come up with that earlier. You can often find out the misunderstandings at the time of the conversation. I say something, you say, no, that's not what I meant, Al. Wow, quick feedback. We kill the problem by the direct communication. Whereas when we have a document, complexity obscures what's going on. So I'm not saying complexity doesn't have a role, but its role is mostly obscuring the relationships between things. And if things weren't tightly coupled, you wouldn't have the big problem either. It's why we can't schedule things out in advance. One person's late, misses a day, but that has a ripple effect because the schedules are so tightly done, way beyond what we can possibly predict. So I invite you to think about complexity's main role is actually hiding, obscuring how things interrelate with each other. Therefore, maybe we need a way to see these relationships, hint, Steve, patterns and inherent simplicity. I know you didn't need the hint. And what we have is small events. Why do small events get out of control? I'm suggesting that they really get out of control when it's tightly coupled, when we don't have visibility. And those are the direct things we should be attending to. Okay, Steve was on.
Yeah, of course. No, this is a really interesting topic, and it has so many facets that it's hard to know from where to start. The reference that is often made in the software world is the Kinefin framework, and I will maybe stick to the terminology there because I think it's a good terminology in establishing what we're talking about. And let's forget about the simple domain and the total chaos, but there between complexity and the complicated domain, that's where interesting things happen. And in this software world, where there are so many unknowns, so many things happening all the time, I think there is a sort of romantic infatuation with the notion of complexity, that everything is complex. Now, there is for sure some part of reality which is complex. We cannot deny that, and that's where you need to apply complexity thinking. That's a domain where the systems thinking approach might have limits. But the point is that if we sort of draw a scale, from 0 to 100, there is this borderline. The boundary stone we talked about before, Al. Now, the boundary stone between the complicated and the complex domain. Where is it on this vision that you have, on your perception of reality? Most people in the software world will say, no, it's the complicated part is very small. Maybe it's 20%, and then you have 80%, which is the complex one. So of course there is more stuff in the complex world. But you know what? No, I'm short-sighted. So if I take this off, I really have to go close, and I still don't see anything. But then I put these on, and focus comes about. So I claim that besides the real complexity that we have in the world, there is a lot of complexity that is produced by our perspective, by our mental models on how we are observing the world. And often it's a matter of having a new perspective, new mental models, and that 20-80% maybe moves. I don't tell you how much it moves, but certainly it moves. So the limited part of reality where you thought you could apply the systems thinking approach expands. It becomes much larger than what you thought was ever possible. And here we have the connection to what you were saying at the beginning, the potential and what we are exploiting right now. The systems thinking, the extent of application of systems thinking is larger than what you think. Of course, it does not go into the complexity domain. There you need complexity thinking, but the extent is much larger. And that is what most people in the software world are missing. And this is where the notion of Goldratt of inherent simplicity comes into place. And it has to do with the degrees of freedom or interconnectedness of elements in the systems we are observing. Now, we do not live in a vacuum. So if I were in a vacuum, I would have infinite degrees of freedom because nothing is affecting me. I can move as I wish. But since we are in a physical world and we interact with one another and we need to collaborate, there is this interdependencies. And what happens is that if I am late, then the next person down the line will maybe even later, and so on. So these chain reactions. So cause and effect all the way. Goldratt's insight was that, well, actually, if we are able to look at this in depth, it is really very, very simple. It is very, very simple. And this is the idea of the constraint. The constraint is that single element that if you affect it, will affect the performance of the entire system. And therefore, what appeared to be very, very complex, in reality is complicated, and you have one precise point where you can intervene. And we see this all the time when one thing is the idea that dependencies are a total killer. And of course, if you see everything as dependent on everything else, it's an exponential network of combinatorial explosion. So it's like chess. Chess is a deterministic game, but there are so many combinations that for us it's untreatable. Now, in this notion, we have the power of determining the dependencies with respect to the constraint. So it's just one sequential, straight dependency line. Very, very simple. But if you tell that to someone who's accustomed to seeing the network of all these dependencies, well, they will be in the same situation of the hunter that doesn't understand the concept of farming. They say, no, it's not possible. Don't you see how complex it is, how interconnected everything is? So no, it's really much simpler, but you must be able to reason in terms of the constraint. Then it becomes inherently simple. Of course, what is the challenge there? Where is the constraint in all of this? And that's it's a huge topic, and it's in the context of knowledge work. I think that's my main contribution to this field, that I have identified ways to find the constraint in this space, especially in what I call the pest environment, where you have multiple projects or products. The P stands for two things. You have many events or deadlines. You have many stakeholders, and you have many teams. So the ultimate environment where chaos is predominant. And by the way, in speaking of chaos, what is really the success factor of how you're managing the organization is not so much how complicated the outside is towards you, but how you appear to the outside. Because the markets, the clients, they hate chaotic performance. They want reliability. They want you to deliver when you promise, so keeping your promises. But if you're not able to manage this apparent complexity, you will miss the deadlines, and you will initiate like those chain reactions of actions and counteractions that typically make the situation worse rather than better. So inherent simplicity is an extremely powerful antidote to all this appearance of complicatedness or complexity.
Yeah, just a quick note to any viewers. If you have questions while Joshua was talking, please put them in the comments. And we only have a few more minutes, but if you have particular questions, go ahead and put them in the comments. And Joshua, why don't you respond on this, and maybe some good question will come up too.
Yeah, so I'll keep mine pretty brief because I mean, Steve, you covered that quite well, and I'll just say that what I feel a lot about complexity, and I think the last time the three of us were together on a previous webinar, we kind of chatted on that, and I think a lot of complexity is brought on by the people themselves, right? I mean, I think it's just it's what they do and how we do things that brings a lot of what we feel is complexity into our space. And with that, because I know we are pretty close, there are two questions. One comment that I'll go ahead and let's go ahead and pull this up. And Al, I think you wanted to chime in on one or two of these.
Yeah. So first of all, I actually like Chet's story better than Ken's story because I got what I said from some conversation Ken had. The point is they're stories. They're a retelling of an event. And the way I heard it, it was a past event. And the way Chet says it, it's a future event. So I like his telling of it better. I'll make that comment. And then what Joseph says, this to Steve. Steve, I'll let you answer that.
What is it? How does, you see, I'm short-sighted. How does Pareto law apply to your upgraded? So I guess Pareto is the 80-20 principle.
Yeah.
Okay, so there are two elements with respect to Pareto. One is that Pareto is used when we are doing like a retrospective analysis. So at the end of a move, and you do the retrospective. What we do in the execution of a move in TameFlow is that when we detect that something is not going to according to our expectation, we make an entry in a reason log. And then in the retrospective, we do a frequency analysis of this, and we might pick the elements that occur more often, or we do a Pareto analysis and we pick the topmost, the 80-20 effect. So that is one application of Pareto within TameFlow. But the other point is that in terms of the effects on process improvement or efficiency, no matter how you want to measure efficiency, TOC is like Pareto on steroids, because if Pareto is 80-20, TOC is 199. The proportion, the lever that you have with TOC is enormously more powerful than Pareto. And this is not my expression. I think it was Goldberg himself or some of the TOC guys who made this observation.
I'd like to say one more thing about that, and then we'll do closing. So one of the interesting things that Dr. Goldratt talks about in The Choice is he comments on Isaac Newton. He was the original Agilist, turns out. No, I'm just kidding. But he did comment on Newton. And Newton says, nature's in harmony. And something I have noticed from reading and understanding Christopher Alexander's work with patterns from The Timeless Way of Building, which I highly recommend, was using the patterns and in starting to really study design through the use of patterns thinking, not the solutions, but the thought process of patterns thinking. What I noticed was that when I attended to the practices like loose coupling or strong cohesion or encapsulation, lack of redundancy, they all seem to work together. In other words, if I improved one, it improved the others. Cohesion makes it easier to encapsulate, as an example. Cohesion makes it easier to decouple, so there's this harmony that Newton talked about. And I'd always noticed this in design of software and things, but I hadn't quite gotten it until a ways back in process. And I'm not even sure I was confident enough to say the same thing was true in how we work until having read this book and then seeing, this is exactly what's true. So when Steve talks about this constraint, sometimes it feels to me that it's like when everything works together, it improves. And when it doesn't work together, it works away. So the thought that you might have one thing that's really driving it, it's not just that one thing in isolation. As he says, it's how it interacts with everything else. There's a harmony of when you improve the constraint, everything seems to improve. And also a harmony, it's odd to say it this way, but it's harmony that things get worse when you make that constraint worse. So I invite you to look for that harmony, that alignment, in a sense, that's out there. So we're going to close. I invite each one to say 15 or 30 seconds. But please do let us know how you thought about this. If you have ideas for future panels, we're planning to do this every week. I had some fun because these are two of my favorite people, both personally and professionally. So I just kind of enjoyed doing this and looking forward to future events, and your feedback's always welcome.
Yeah, so well, no, thank you for inviting me to be part of this, Al and Joshua. I also think it's really a fun way of having these discussions, and I also invite all the audience to give us feedback and bring up like the topics that you would like to see us discussing or debating.
Yeah, and I'll thank you guys as well for inviting me to participate with you. And yeah, I think it would be great to get some feedback on what are some of the topics you would like us to talk about. And as this kind of evolves, hopefully it'll be more just like a typical podcast where it'll be a little bit more of a light approach, not a lot of slides and graphs, and just things that we can talk and share our experiences in. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Al, for the final close.
Well, just stay safe. Hope to see you next week, or be seen by you seeing us next week. And take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.